Good afternoon and good evening for all our audience stretched halfway across the globe these days. Welcome to our panel today at the Gulf International Forum on the pathway forward in Iraq. Whatever else may have occurred, Iraq's politics are no longer business as usual. After two failed attempts by other better-known politicians, Mr. Mustafa al-Kadhimi has put together a government that seems to have the support of almost all the political factions in the country, and more importantly, the two principal outside players, the US and Iran. Most observers believe that Mr. Kadhimi understands and will try to fix the systemic problems of Iraq. Nevertheless, despite these early positive signs, the protesters have returned to the streets after weeks of suspended protest owing to the COVID-19 outbreak and the curfew that was imposed across Iraq as part of the response to the pandemic. Question: why should the protesters accept Mr. Kadhimi's promises? Do the protest movement's lack of unified leadership make it possible to keep them off the streets? We have with us today three informed and distinguished observers of and participation in the Iraqi political scene. You all have access to their full biographies that can be found on our online invitation, so I will not take up your valuable time repeating the information. Dr. Randa Slim currently serves as the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute, non-resident fellow at SAIS. She has had a distinguished career at many prestigious academic organizations. Dr. Slim has authored several studies, book chapters, and articles on conflict management, post-conflict peace building, and Middle East politics. Dr. Anthony Pfaff currently serves as a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative and as a research professor at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Dr. Pfaff retired as a colonel after a distinguished career in the United States Army. He has had many important assignments concerning the Middle East as a combat officer and a commander in the region and in the United States, including as a senior advisor to the State Department's policy planning staff. He has written on many military and political subjects for professional and scholarly publications. Ms. Maysoon Al-Damluji currently serves as the advisor on culture and reconstruction for His Excellency the President of Iraq, Mr. Barham Saleh. Prior to that appointment, she served 3 terms in the Iraqi parliament, and prior to that as Deputy Minister of Culture in Iraq's first post-invasion government. Ms. Damluji has graciously stepped in at almost literally the 11th hour when Dr. Akhil Abbas had to withdraw from the panel. We are very grateful. Just one small piece of bookkeeping at the bottom. You will find the QA. Please, as you think of questions, make them there. So starting in that order, I'll get out of the way. Dr. Slim.
Thank you, Ambassador, and good afternoon, everybody, and good evening to friends in Iraq and the Middle East who are observing this video. And I thank the Gulf International Forum for the invitation, and I'm honored to share this panel with my colleagues. And so I was asked to talk about the PMU, the government formation, and the prospects for the PMU going forward. Let me just preface my remarks by saying that any prime minister in the current political climate and conditions, prime minister designate in Iraq cannot make it to the finish line unless that person, hopefully she in the future, has secured cobbled together a coalition of supporters in the COR among the political blocs. Most importantly, right now, Mr. Muqtada al-Sadr and Mr. Hadi al-Amiri, who are the leaders of the 2 largest parliamentary blocs. But then also importantly, that designate has to also has at least some support, or let's see, not a hard veto, from the 2 external players in Iraq, the 2 external influential players in Iraq, meaning the United States and Iran. And I don't mean that, Iranians and Americans are imposing their will on Iraqis. I think Iraqis can do this business on their own. It's their government, it's their country. What I'm saying is that the realities are such that even Iraqi politicians, and Ms. Al-Damluji might disagree with me or agree with me, I'm eager to hear her remarks, in their consideration of possible candidates for this position, they always have in their minds candidates who will be able to be accepted by both of these external influential players. I think gone are the days when either country can impose its will on Iraqis. And that's good, in my opinion. Having said that, I think Mr. Al-Kadhimi's programs has a number of priorities. Some of them are going to be things he needs to focus on immediately, and others, in my opinion, are going to be aspirational, given the fact that this is a government that is going to have a short time frame to work with, assuming that elections will be held in 2022 or even earlier. And so some of the priorities he's going to be focusing on, the most important priority is going to be the twin crisis, health and economic, gripping Iraq. In the span of 1 week, there are 600 new cases of COVID-19. Iraq has had it easy until now, in my opinion, in terms of the number of the cases and the number of deaths. But if there is an accelerated uptick in the number of cases, I think that's going to take a lot of oxygen in terms of focus of the cabinet. And add to that, of course, the precipitous decline of oil prices, which means that budget revenues, 90% of which are dependent on oil, are shrinking dramatically, have shrunk dramatically, and that's going to have implications for how he's going to balance, Mr. Kadhimi balance the payrolls, investment in infrastructure, electricity, health, education, payment, for the military and for others. Having said that, I think the other two priorities that among others that he lists, which is tackling corruption and security sector reforms, I think, including the PMUs and their role in a military strategic doctrine, if we can put it this way, going forward for Iraq, I think, or military defensive strategy, I think that's something that is going to be hard for Mr. Al-Kadhimi to address in the next 2 years, given the priorities that I talked about earlier. And so in terms of the future of the PMUs, for your audience, I highly recommend a paper written by a group of authors in March 2020, published March 2020 by WINEP on the PMUs. The first author is Michael Knightson of the paper. It's a very detailed paper. I disagree with some of its recommendations, but it's a great read in terms of the organization and the makeup and the laws and the whole architecture underpinning the PMU in Iraq. I think in understanding the future of the PMU, we, while fully aware of the limitations placed on Mr. Al-Kadhimi on tackling security sector reform in the next 2 years, including the status and the roles and the duties and whatever of the PMU, I think there are certain opportunities that are opening that are now availing themselves that might create a critical time for some action by the government of Iraq to help rein in the PMU. One opening is the dissent that we are seeing inside the PMU ranks. We have seen recently the dissent between the spokesperson of the Fatah coalition, Al-Ghadban, and Asa'ib al-Haq, when Al-Ghadban made a statement, calling for support of the United States for Iraq. Although it was a nuanced statement, it's not a total, call for U.S. support. It was a nuanced statement, but still, for a leader of the Fatah bloc in parliament to make this statement at this time, I think is important enough, and the response from Asa'ib al-Haq was strong enough to portray that kind of dissent in their midst. We have seen a split inside the PMF. 4 brigades called the Shrine Brigades have basically left, the leadership, or have left the structure, the organizational structure of the PMF, and placed themselves in under the command of the Prime Minister, and that reflects some kind of a position that is interpreted in Iraq as being that of the Marja'iyya, as wanting more control over the PMU by the Iraqi state and over the weapons. And the Marja'iyya has made a number of statements, including a statement by one representative of Ayatollah Sistani, Hamd al-Khaffaf, last year, in which was pretty strong on the importance of bringing all weapons under state control. The other point that I think presents an opening also for some action on the PMU is the behavior of the PMU. Gone are the days when there was a mission of fighting ISIS. ISIS is no longer the existential threat that it used to be. And we are seeing more and more of the PMU's leadership, as well as fighters, in different areas of Iraq, engage either in illegal or illicit, most of the time illicit economic activities, more interested in making money than in fighting, engaged in racketeering schemes, in extortion, in kidnapping. And that is somehow also creating a change in the support base for the PMU. So I predict that maybe by the time we have the next elections in 2022, especially if the ISIS threat remains under control, and that raison d'etre that the PMU came around or was formed around, which is fighting ISIS, becomes more and more less relevant, and more of that role is being borne out by the Iraqi security services. We can expect maybe the political parties affiliated with the PMU to gain less support in the next election than they have done today. Let me conclude here by saying that, when it comes to dealing with non-state actors, armed non-state actors, in fragile state situation, like it is the case in Iraq, I have this, there is a theory that, this theory that in conflict trajectory like that, there are certain times when interventions, if not made, you miss an important opportunity to change the conflict trajectory. I would say, for example, in the case of Syria, for example, President Obama's decision not to attack Assad's air force and airfields in 2013, in my opinion, denied us an opportunity to change totally the Syrian conflict trajectory. And time will tell. History, future historians will analyze that. I think in Lebanon, an experience with non-state actors here, armed non-state actors. I think in 2000, after the Israeli withdrawal from the south of Lebanon, there was a unique opportunity at the time for Lebanese leaders to come together and address the problem of what to do with Hezbollah, and to disarm eventually, disarm Hezbollah, partly because there was no longer after that a national consensus for the weapons of Hezbollah. And with the right leadership, with the right geopolitical conditions, which were not present at the time, we could have solved that problem, which Lebanon is suffering from and will continue to suffer from. And the fragility of Lebanon will always be due in a major part to the weapons outside state control. I think Iraq today is facing this kind of point with the PMU, and I think it is not something that has to be done right away, but also it's not a window that's going to last forever. I think Iraq today is facing a window that is, with all these conditions I talked about that are affecting the internal cohesion of the PMU, Iran's role, a factor which I missed. I think the killing of Soleimani and Abu al-Muhandis really has caused Iran to lose some of its footing in Iran, but also, in Iraq, but also in the region. And that's not going to stay for long. I think Iran eventually will be able to reorganize itself, especially the IRGC will be able to reorganize itself and regain its footing. So all these conditions create this, unique window of opportunity for Iraq to proceed with the security sector reform, including, reining in the PMU, bringing the PMU and its weapons under effective state control. They are supposed to be, according to the legislation, but they really are only nominally, under state control, but they are not, in terms of command and control structure. And so I'm afraid that because of the economic conditions facing Iraq, Iraq might miss this opportunity. And if this window of opportunity is missed, then it's going to be difficult to be able to deal with this problem, which, like Lebanon, is going to haunt Iraq for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Dr. Slim, thank you very much for that cross-section, that very broad sweep of the problems facing the new government. One question did occur to me while you were speaking. You saw the PMUs as the primary spoilers. Are there other actors in Iraq who would serve as spoilers because they prefer the status quo, which serves them better, besides the PMUs?
Yes, of course. There are many political actors, that look, I think the problem today with the status quo in Iraq is that it's split in Iraq. And again, Ms. Damluji is better positioned to answer this question, than I. But let me just take a crack at it. I think the status quo today benefits the 2003 political class that basically, came to see this political system and the rules of the game that have been in place in Iraq since 2003 as something that is it's something that they are owed, because of the years of exile, because of the blood and treasure they spent fighting Saddam. And this is a political class that's going to, fight giving up its power. No political class will agree to give up its power, willingly and easily, especially in the Arab region. They will fight for it. And then you have a good portion of the Iraqi public, especially, the protesters, the youth, who did not grow up with Saddam, who do not see these rules of the game as serving their interests. They are rejecting totally these rules of the game. So there is this generational clash, in my opinion, and that's going to stay with Iraq. It's about social contract. It's about new rules of the game going forward. And the question is how this can be negotiated. Can it be negotiated through a political process, or can it be a gradual evolution? Will Iraq have the economic capacities? Will have the time to renegotiate the social contract through a political process? Or are we going to see more violence as the means being practiced by all parties, including protesters, as a way of renegotiating the social contract?
Thank you. Dr. Pfaff, care to jump in now?
Yes, sir. First, I'd like to thank everybody, the Gulf Forum, for inviting me here, and greetings to all of you out there. And first, the disclaimer that these views are my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. government or the Army War College. But what I thought I'd do is kind of focus more on the U.S.-Iraq relations from the U.S. perspective, and discuss maybe a little bit about the possibilities that Khatami's nomination might be opening up. But first, a little context, I think, will help. And from my perspective, until December 2019, U.S.-Iraq relations were probably best described as either stuck in a rut or going downhill. Reigning influence had limited military and economic cooperation to basically fighting ISIS, some weapon sales, and humanitarian assistance. In fact, the Iranian influence had exacerbated Iraq's corrupt government culture and prevented any meaningful reforms to put Iraq on a path to recovery. And it appeared as though Tehran was well on its way to achieving what appeared to be its vision for Iraq, which was a government relatively subservient to Iran, which shared the monopoly on the use of force with Tehran and its proxy militias, which we just heard a lot about. And more importantly for us in the United States, a diminished relationship with the U.S. that precluded any meaningful political, military, or economic cooperation. I think the strikes that killed Soleimani, as well as the Popular Mobilization Committee Deputy Chief Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, as well as other members of Kataib Hezbollah, in retaliation for attacks on U.S. forces, may have created a moment, that watershed moment that will either solidify Iraq's position and move it closer to Iran, or provide the United States with the opening it needs to set the relationship on better footing. Whether the water pushes that relationship along or drowns it, however, remains to be seen, and I think depends a lot on what happens next. But what that tit for tat strikes have done since December has, I think, put Iran's vision for an Iraqi state in something of a disarray, though I agree that's probably a temporary situation. But it also, at the time, marginalized the largely anti-Iranian protests that were going on and directed popular anger at U.S. forces. Is out. The government is circumspect in its response to the U.S. airstrikes or this tit-for-tat exchange. The question remains, the larger question, which is what was putting that relationship on that downward trend in the first place, which was continued frustration at a lack of progress, despite the investment of billions of dollars in Iraq's recovery, which had left both Iraqis and Americans frustrated. Exacerbating that situation was the conflict with Iran, the larger U.S.-Iran conflict, which was fomenting tension that undermines the stability that both the United States and Iraq want to achieve, and it was hampering prospects for immediate cooperation. However, there's, I think, with Khatami's nomination, finally some good news. It appears that there's someone in power who might just be able to balance Iraq's relations with the U.S. and its neighbor Iran. His mandate, of course, is focused on elections, and doing that will be hard enough. Aside from the huge logistic and security issues required that he'll be required to resolve, the elections will only be meaningful if there is a large enough voter turnout, which was not the case in 2018. And if they're not able to achieve that, then the Iran-backed political parties, which rely on voter intimidation and election fraud, will likely prevail again. Furthermore, and I think this will be something we're talking about in detail later, the elections will be truly representative of Iraq's growing nationalist movement. Al-Khatami will also have to address the sectarian quota system that perpetuates the current parliamentary gridlock. The current parliament, which benefits from that, will likely put up a fight, but that's something that will have to be addressed and will impact what can happen between the U.S. and Iraq after those elections. But the other bit of good news, I think, is that Al-Khatami's confirmation clearly demonstrates that the U.S. has not lost Iraq to Iran, which was a major theme here in Washington among those working Iraq policies. Tehran's candidate, Assad al-Aidani, couldn't even get nominated. While Khatami may not exactly be the U.S. candidate, he is certainly open to improving relations. Openness provides the United States with an opportunity to set those relations on a better path. Here it's worth talking about the Strategic Framework Agreement, because I think doing that is going to require us to get beyond the aspirational language of the agreement and work harder to specify very specific, mutually beneficial objectives that are both achievable and sustainable. Now, for the United States, I think the overall goal should be an Iraq that is a contributing member of the international community and a positive force for regional stability, and has the appropriate institutions and are sufficiently plugged into the international community, is able on its own to grow its own economy. Being there is certainly achievable, and it does not require fully resolving all the well-known dysfunctions that are part of the Iraqi government, nor does it require significantly more spending by the United States. Some reforms within the Iraqi political system that would hopefully open up the kinds of resources to make the necessary reforms in its political and economic and financial systems. And the final bit of good news is I think Al-Khatami's nomination creates new space for the U.S. to facilitate those outcomes. But taking advantage of that opportunity will require the United States to have a clear vision of what it wants out of the relationship and a roadmap to get there. And it will also require a willingness and a flexibility that I don't know that we currently have to take advantage of opportunities as they arise to address those to move us down that road. To put a little more substance to it, I think there's three immediate goals for U.S. policy in Iraq, which would be helping Iraqis contest the malign aspects of Iranian influence that keep Iraq from fully recovering. I think it's also to prevent the reemergence of ISIS or any other like-minded terrorist organizations. And finally, opening Iraq's economy to foreign investment to accelerate its domestic economic growth and reform. I think there are these can be achieved through the following measures. First, the United States needs to move Iraq out of the middle of its conflict with Iran. The less the United States places Iraq in the middle of this conflict, the easier, I think, things will be in Iraq. Moreover, U.S. policies or engagement that places the Iraqi government in a position where its cooperation with Iranian security or vital interests would likely yield a little cooperation, even with the Qadami's government. And to the extent they did, would likely reignite sectarian divisions and regional tensions, consequently undermining not just Iraq's, but the United States' larger interests as well. Next, I think the U.S. needs to pay more attention to what I would call its comparative advantages. Because in addition to being a better security partner, the United States can assist Iraq with integrating into the international community and developing the kind of economic and financial institutions necessary for Iraq to fully integrate. There's a lot that needs to be done. I think in the immediate term, we could benefit from establishing a dialogue and opening Iraqi markets for foreign investment, which also should include diversifying investment in the energy sector that could also address capturing the natural gas that is currently being vented, which would get Iraq increase its revenues significantly. I think the U.S. could also do little things, not little things, but take steps like helping get some of the $30 billion that was pledged at the Kuwait conference committed to building to Iraqi infrastructure projects. Both would be kind of difficult. We've been trying to do gas capture, working with Iraqis for gas capture for about 2 decades. And pledges from the Kuwait conference do have conditions, but I think the moment now might be ripe to sort of move some of those along, which could get some, I think, good development going. I won't talk too much about, I agree that we need to continue to insist on the integration of Iran-backed militias and the PMU and the larger PMU into Iraq security forces. I think and in this regard, I think the United States should seek a commitment from this government to at least put pressure on the militias to stop these attacks. I know that they don't have a lot of room to maneuver, but any assistance the United States can do to get them to have that kind of pressure, I think, is important. And in that regard, I think it's also important the United States separate its objectives relative to the PMUs from the Iran-backed militias and the popular mobilization other parts of the popular mobilization forces that don't have an association with Iran. I also think there needs to be more of a commitment on both sides to telling the full story of the U.S.-Iraq relations. A lot of what the United States does for Iraq is channeled through other organizations, so the Iraqi people don't get to see it, and I think would benefit both the United States and Iraq if Iraqi leadership would recognize the billions that have been spent and are continue to being spent, recognize that the United States is a valuable partner and providing Iraq with a lot of assistance, including assistance beyond that focused on security. And then finally, relative to security, there's going to be a lot of discussion, and I think this is what we're talking about in the Q&A regarding the demands to withdraw U.S. forces. I think there's some kind of change is probably going to happen, but it does kind of. But the U.S.-Iraq military cooperation relationship is a lot more complex than simple troops on the grounds, and I think from the U.S. perspective, what we would want to maintain in the overall security relationship is the advisory and intelligence cooperation that is currently ongoing. And it's worth noting that any troop withdrawal will place just an additional burden on Iraqi forces as they continue to fight ISIS, which is currently apparently resurging again. So I think that the politics kind of work against some of that, but I think it's possible in this moment that at least some aspects of that security relationship can be saved and built on later. And on that cheerful note, I will conclude. Thank you.
Dr. Pfaff, thank you very much. That certainly gave a very good description of what the United States should be doing. I do have a question. There seems to be a certain distraction going on in Washington in the United States government, and there also seem to be different views on how we should proceed vis-a-vis Iraq or vis-a-vis Iran. Could you talk for a couple of minutes on what you believe to be, whether there is a coherent American policy towards Iraq, and if not, which way is it going?
That's a great question and a great point. I do think it's quite a problem that so much of our Iraq policy has been subordinated to our objectives relative to Iran, and I think it's extremely important to separate the two. We should have an Iraq policy, one aimed at building better relations with Iraq, which is an important country in the region, can be a good partner towards stability. Without having to be involved or directly, at least, in our current confrontation with Iran. So we do need to separate it. I think the good news is, at least at the State Department, they broke up the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State position that was for Iran and Iraq. Now they've broken that up into two different positions. So now there's a separate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq, which I think is very hopeful because that will allow for a greater concentration of, policy-making resources, for lack of a better way of putting it, to engage Iraq as a partner that has a range of interests along not just security or fighting, ISIS that we can engage on without getting distracted by what's going on with the relationship with Iran. So, as an indicator, I think that's a positive trend, and I'm going to be hopeful. Those hopes have been dashed before, but I think I think that's a positive sign.
Dr. Pfaff, I'm really happy that you noted something that people don't always understand, is that the organizational structure in departments like the State Department, the Defense Department, actually influence how policy is made and carried out. And now for the home team, in fact, the most important from a viewpoint, the viewpoint of the country most at risk here. Mrs. Maysoon, Al-Damluji, please.
Hello, thank you very much, Ambassador Theros. I really came at the very last moment, so I'll give us a very short talk about the elections of 2018 and also the protests that came afterwards. And I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards. Well, the 2018 elections came with a very low turnout due to reduced faith in the electoral process. The population viewed the elections as being rigged, and their vote would not challenge the control and monopoly of political parties over the results of the elections. The electoral law was viewed as enabling only those with external support and foreign allegiance on one hand, using large amounts of money and resources that were unlawfully obtained on the other. I think Dr. Pfaff spoke about this earlier. The electoral law was viewed as unfair, enabling only those with external support and foreign allegiance. The Electoral Commission itself was seen as biased, whose members were part and parcel of political parties that had full intention to remain in power, despite their obvious lack of delivery. Despite all this, election results were made legitimate by both political parties and the international community. All this took place following immense sacrifice made by ordinary people in the war against ISIS. Yet it was widely felt that victory was hijacked by a handful of politicians, militias, and warlords who need to be questioned about their role in the initial defeat to ISIS when it took over 1/3 of the land of Iraq. People viewed the newly elected parliament as some kind of a parasite with little intention to improve their living standards, yet strong determination to deliver another war where the poor would be sacrificed. Not surprisingly, massive protests were to ignite in Baghdad and southern provinces, demanding reforms to the electoral process and early elections, carrying only the Iraqi flag and chanting slogans and songs that call for unity of all sects and ethnicities under a united Iraqi national identity. Over 700 young boys and girls were killed and assassinated, and thousands were injured, leaving many disabled. Iranian-backed militias were blamed for this event. And here I think we should make a difference between PMU and militias. Now, the PMU is a force that really fought against ISIS. When the Marja'iyya, Sayyid Ali Sistani, asked them to do so, they volunteered for it. The militias, on the other hand, do not take their orders from the Iraqi prime minister. They take orders from Iran, and they work for Iranian interests. We really should distinguish between PMU and militias. This is a very sensitive topic for Iraqis. Anyway, so back to the protests. The political parties that opposed the protests lacked the meaningful response. Instead of arguing a case and claiming achievements to Iraqis, it accused the protesters of being jokers and accused them of receiving money from the USA and from Israel and other countries like Saudi Arabia, etc. Eventually, the government, Adel Abdel Mahdi, had to resign, leaving 5 eventful months when Iraq was without full government. The assassination of Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis causing a rise of tensions between Iran and USA, and the coronavirus pandemic, and eventually dramatic drop in oil prices, all happened while Iraq was without a functioning government. 2 candidates were rejected by both parliament and protesters before Kadhimi managed to pass his government, despite obvious hesitance by Iranian-backed militias and political parties. It is still early days in Kadhimi's office, yet he has made some small gestures that address the protesters, including reappointing Abdul Wahab al-Sa'di, attacking, and Abdul Wahab al-Sa'di was one of the heroes of the war against ISIS. He was dismissed by Adel Abdel Mahdi, the dismissal was one important reason that the protesters took place in Baghdad and eventually the rest of the southern provinces. Attacking Tharallah militia and Basra and promising accountability concerning violence to protesters. We will have to keep our eyes open to days to come and provide support when it is due to Kadhimi's government. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer questions later on.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maysoon. Sort of one question. Has Prime Minister Kadhimi indicated if he has a governing concept for reform in the country, or is he approaching this pragmatically? I mean, this is first for you, but for all the other panelists as well.
Well, he has put together a government plan made of a number of points, and it is a very ambitious plan, if I may say so. He is required to put together early elections, and maybe not so early. I mean, by the way, early. We only have 2 years left for the original elections. Now, the problem is going to be with the electoral law, because although it was initially passed in Parliament, it did not go to the presidency to be ratified by the president. And now I understand that the Parliament is hesitant because apparently, according to the new law, the constituencies will increase in number but reduce in size, which means that the sectarian balance is going to be shifted. There will be, apparently what I understand is that there will be more Sunni MPs than there is now, which will affect the equilibrium of it all, of the political process. So, especially in Baghdad, this will be affected. So, it has not passed to the presidency yet. And I understand there's going to be changes to the electoral law before it goes. Now, without an electoral law, there will be no elections. So, Kadhimi is going to be put in a very difficult corner unless the law is passed. So it is. The parliament is playing games at the moment with the electoral law to stop the early elections. So going back to your question, yes, it is. He has put together plans to combat corruption, to deal with militias, outlawed, and to bring to accountability those who caused the assassination and death of the protesters, etc. But I'm not sure he'll be able to do all these things. But the way he dealt with Ta'arallah and Basra indicates that he has the will to do things the right way, the Iraqi way, and not give in to Iran the way Adil Abdul Mahdi did.
Thank you. Dr. Pfaff, Dr. Slim?
I hate to disagree with here because, but I think we are putting too much into Mr. Al-Kadhimi action vis-a-vis Ta'arallah, partly because, and use it as too early, in my opinion, or read too much into it as an indication of both his willingness as well as his capacity to rein in the PMF and bring them under effective state control, and that has to do mostly with the nature of the militia itself, Ta'arallah. I think the way this kind of outfit, or action against this kind of outfit of the kind that Mr. Al-Kadhimi took is not going to be across too many red lines, especially, Iranian red lines or some red lines from leaders like Al-Amiri or Asayib al-Haq. So I think this was an easy entity to go after, given the whole the lack of support it has inside its milieu in Basra, given its previous track record with criminal activities, and given its position vis-a-vis the whole Iran-backed proxy network. And so, this was a good move, but I think I will believe Mr. Al-Kadhimi's willingness and capacity to do something really strong if he were to go against Asayib al-Haq, for example. That's a tall order, and that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. So in that respect, I think. And then the other point that I think PMF, they are, whether they are militias or not, but they are a good part of the PMF is backed by Iran and are Iranian proxies. Now, and that's not to say that the majority of the PMF is not Iran-backed, and that's the problem here, is that we apply this one big lens on the PMF as a monolith, and the PMF is not a monolith. I mean, they all, as Maysoon said, these are volunteers who heeded the call of Ayatollah Sistani in 2014 after ISIS took over Mosul and left, their jobs, left their families, left their towns to fight against ISIS, and they paid a heavy sacrifice. But also, this is not to say that a good portion of them are not, Iranian proxies, and not to say also that they are running a parallel state. The PMF is supposed to be under state authority, but the way it operates, it's not under command and control of the prime minister. It takes decision to fight in Syria, even if the prime minister is opposed to it. And there are a number of executive orders starting in July of 2019 issued by the former Prime Minister Adel Abdel-Mahdi for the objective of reforming the PMF and bringing their activities under control, separating between political arms and fighters, redeploying, and none of these executive orders have yet been, implemented. So the PMF still has its parallel judiciary. It's had its parallel prisons. I mean, recently, Prime Minister Al-Qadimi asked for all detainees of the protesters who were detained during the protest to be released. Some of them were not released, partly because they are detained in prisons that are not controlled by the government of Iraq. So there is this reality. Yes, the PMF started as a volunteer force, but where the PMF is today and how eventually, at the time, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Kataib Hezbollah came to control the PMF is a fact, and that's why I think the disappearing of Mr. al-Muhandis from the scene and its patron, General Qasem Soleimani, from the scene, create a unique opportunity for Iraq to really handle the PMF in a way that prevents it to be under the control of Tehran and responsive to Tehran, at least on its leadership level.
Dr. Pfaff, any ideas?
No, just a couple, because I don't have a lot to add. I completely agree. I agree with just about everything that's been said. In terms of, but in answering the question on, the possibilities for Qadimi's government, I think it's going to be important for him to stay focused. He's not, as everybody has indicated, there's a lot of things we want to accomplish, and they're all, and it's going to be very difficult to do that. So he's got to have a pretty good idea of what he wants his government to accomplish, stay focused on that. That requires I go back to the idea of a roadmap. How do I get there from here? And if I can't get there here, what conditions have to happen to remove that obstacle or roadblock, and then look for opportunities to establish those conditions. I completely agree that I don't see anyone, the Iraqi security forces, for example, going after Iranian proxies as we saw in the Charge of the Knights, I think back in 2008. But, there are resources inside Iraq, a lot of that can help constrain their ability to operate, to include building relations with the Marja'iyya and getting them on board with, again, staying focused on those things that are going to get his government from where it's at to if his goal is elections, to those elections in a timely fashion. And I think the good news is also, as I look through the ministers that have made it through, most of them seem to have a level of competence. I use the word technocrats. That they're in a position to actually, they know how to make this happen. They can help them identify those things that needs to look at to set the conditions in order to get us down that road. But again, it's small steps at this point.
Thank you. I'm happy to say that the first question from the audience is from a former mentor of mine, Ambassador Harold Walker, Hookie Walker. He may not remember me. I was pretty junior when he was teaching me how to do my job. What led Iran, as it would appear, to accept Qadimi after objecting to earlier candidates for prime minister? What reversed Iranian policy? To anybody?
Well, can I?
Yes, please.
Well, first of all, Iran is going through a very hard time economically and politically. It needs Iraq. Iraq is the lung that Iran breathes from at the moment. It needs dollars from Iraq. It doesn't, a complete cut of relations between Iraq and the U.S. is not in Iran's favor. Iran needs Iraq as its backyard. There's no point in swallowing Iraq as whole if it can make use of Iraq's relationship with the U.S. This is on the one hand. And on the second hand, it is the people of the South that went on protests, and they are mostly Shia. Iran has always portrayed itself as the defender of Shias in the world. Now, For the first time, young Iraqis in the South refuse this kind of patronage. So they have problems within and they have problems with Iraq. They have to improve their relationships with Iraq. Al-Kadhimi was accused of taking part in the assassination of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Soleimani. This was the initial response, but then I think Iran felt that it needed this kind of relationship, someone close to the US, in order to maintain their relationship with Iraq. This is how I see it.
Anyone else?
I have to say there are a lot of conspiracy theories being spun in Baghdad as well as in the region about why the sudden convergence of interests between Iran and the US on the person of Mustafa al-Kadhimi. And I totally agree with Maysoon is that there are certain, conditions, both inside Iran and regionally, that might have created an incentive for Iran. But I think also, Mr. Qademi is not a person who is, vetoed by Iran. He might not be Iran's preferred choice, but he's not a person on whom there is a hard veto, by Iran, who's not acceptable. And I have to say that also, that applies to Mr. Qademi, but also it applies to a lot of Shia candidates for the prime minister. They have a deep bench, of potential candidates that they can live with. There are certain that there is a hard veto on, but I think they have a deep bench, and Mr. Al-Kadhimi fits this criteria of somebody who is acceptable, and there is no way. I mean, there's no need to exercise their political capital with Iraqis in vetoing his candidacy.
Dr. Pfaff?
Yeah, no, I can make this short because short answer is I don't know. But I think as everyone has said at this point, this is just sort of evidence of the kind of moment we're in, where things that couldn't have happened before can happen now, where a candidate that actually is acceptable to the United States is also a candidate acceptable to Iran because it's time to move forward, because of the protests, because of the effects of the pandemic, because of the crashing oil prices, because all of these things, I think, well, I have no doubt there were discussions and some deals struck and promises made. I do think this is evidence that we're at a moment where I think we can make where progress can be made.
Okay, let me put together a bunch of economic questions that have shown up. Not quoting any particular one, but clearly there's been this double whammy that has hit the region, not just Iraq. COVID-19 on the back of an oil price drop, which then converted into an oil price implosion. Everybody's economy in the region has been hit like a ton of bricks. In the past, the United States, for example, had indicated that they were expecting Saudi Arabia to play a major role in helping the Iraqi economy recover. So it's sort of a 2 or 3 part question. The first is, are there any bright spots in Iraq's economy right now? An earlier speaker in another panel talked to us about the fact that Iraq has had one of the best wheat harvests in a generation. Is there a relationship with a positive relationship with Saudi Arabia? Do the Saudis have the wherewithal or even the energy at the moment to help the Iraqis? Are there other things the United States could do that would help or hinder Iraq? For example, what's the effect of the 30-day relaxation of waivers, the 30-day exercise of waivers on trading with Iran? I'll take it from anybody. Wave a hand.
I don't mind starting. If no one else does, in my comments, I made a point about I don't know the answer to are there any bright spots? There might be. there's certainly the potential for bright spots, and that's why. And when my initial comments, I talked a little bit about the $30 billion that was raised in pledges from the reconstruction conference held in Kuwait. I think it was last February. Or February before last. And those funds have largely not been spent. This relates to your Saudi Arabia question, because a lot of those, as I understand it, a lot of those funds come from places like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. There's a couple of, there's conditions on these and a lot of reluctance to make good on the pledges. In order to get those pledges made, a couple of things need to happen. A, there needs to be a viable proposal for how to spend them. That's a place where the United States can help Iraq. Is to put that kind of program together. Secondly, because of that perception that Iraq was drawing closer to Iran, the countries that pledge this money are kind of reluctant to actually commit it. So that's another place for the United States. And Kadami's nomination can kind of be a moment where there may be able to improve that willingness to commit some of that money. I don't know what the current oil prices are going, and effect on budgets are going to do to prevent that, but something is certainly worth engaging in. And your point about the wheat harvest is I think, is an important one, because up until 1958, it was agriculture that was Iraq's dominant export. And the nice thing about if we can help Iraq diversify and build its agricultural economy, that's a job-creating industry in a way that the energy sector just isn't. So looking for those kinds of opportunities. So that kind of potential's there. Can we turn that into actual opportunities? I think that's where a lot of our focus should go.
I think there's also this agreement which last year Iraqi official signed with the GCC in terms of the interconnectivity framework agreement with the GCC Interconnection Authority, GCCIA, to diversify power imports and create a regional utility market. I think this also can help with the objective that the US has in creating more independence of Iraq from the Iranian gas imports, and helps in further cementing ties between GCC and Iraq. There have also been last year many bilateral agreements signed between Egypt and Iraq on the creation of joint commission, joint industrial zones, agreements between Jordan and Iraq, the Aqaba Basra pipeline. I think these are initiatives which were started to help Iraq more join its Arab neighborhood, and I think these are initiatives that also can be built upon going forward. The question is going to be the economic realities of the region, as you have pointed out. That's going to push most of the countries, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, to prioritize domestic spending, domestic issues, and focus less on regional projects.
In the same vein, I have seen in the past an interest by China in exploiting Iraq's strategic position. Iraq, after all, is at the head of the Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf, that it borders important countries to its north and to its west, as well as Iran. Has anyone any commentary or seen anything on Chinese interest in including Iraq, in the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, I gather no one did. Has seen any interest?
Well, I mean, what little I do know about China's interest in Iraq is it's easily frustrated. Iraqis, and I think someone said earlier, Iraqis are very sensitive about the idea of a foreign country of any kind coming in, extracting its resources, even if that means pumping money into Iraq's economy, and then taking those resources out. And the Chinese don't have a really good model for that connects well with Iraqi structure, and certainly I think raises these sensitivities. So what I do know from my time is watching this as a defense attaché in Baghdad several years ago. Chinese companies would come in. They were well represented in industrial forums and trade shows and that kind of thing. But
true.
they had a hard time getting an actual contract because that contract would seem a little exploitive, and B, the mechanisms aren't there in Iraq to move money around such that the Chinese, could actually, so that the Chinese funds can come in and then they could take and funds could go back out again. So I think China has interest. I think Iraqi interest is kind of limited, given the nature of how China does things with foreign countries, and the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure, isn't there to allow for a big investment in a wide variety of sectors, which is something that we also should address.
Returning to domestic politics, I'm sorry, Maysoon? Mr. Maysoon?
Yeah, I was going to say something about China. Obviously, the relationship between Iraq and China is old. Iraq is a good market for Chinese goods, and also Chinese do work as in oil fields in Amara, especially. But the thing about Adel Abdel Mahdi's government is that there was a visit to China, and there is much talk about a deal that was struck between Adel Abdel Mahdi and the Chinese government, which was never made open. I mean, it was never published or anything, but we hear about great projects that the Chinese were going to make to build in Iraq, like ports and airports and roads and what have you. But I think it was a way of Adel Abdel Mahdi's government to kind of prove that they, or to show that the problem with the US is the newly built relationship with China, which I doubt very much. I mean, it was used as a game that the protesters came out because of the relationship between Adel Abdel Mahdi's government and China. This is the conspiracy theory. It was the conspiracy theory at its best, I think. I don't think there's much change in the relationship between Iraq and China anyway. We've always had good relations with China.
Yeah. Returning to domestic politics, we have a question about one of the people who's played one of the most important roles in the post-2003 history of Iraq, Muqtada Sadr. He was at first a supporter of the protests and then turned against him. Is he still a major player? Has he been harmed by turning against the protesters?
Can I answer?
Yeah, please.
Well, Sadr has his own constituents, and by and large, his constituency has remained the same, although maybe it has reduced in numbers, but not significantly yet. It is early days. But among the other population, I think he lost his credibility in a large sense. I mean, one day he was with the protesters, then he attacked them, then he was very unstable during these protests, during the protest period, and he is accountable for many killings and injuries caused to the protesters. So I think, by and large, he lost credibility, but less so among his own community and his followers.
By the way, he has recently said that he gives the new government, as he has done in the past, 100 days, and after that, if they do not, perform, then he's going to change his support for them. He's being at least consistent, because that's what he said for previous governments as well.
Yes.
Does anyone see a role now for Russia in what is going on in Iraq, or is Russia totally absent other than its participation in Syria?
No, I think Russia has been long interested in the oil sector in Iraq, and there are a number of agreements between Russian oil companies and especially in the KRG. And it remains, interested. Also, the Russian political spectrum has, although it has been long, many of them are old, but it has had long relationships and in terms of presence in the country. And so the whole issue of what's happening in the region and whether that creates opportunities for Russia, for countries like China, to make, to gain more of a foothold in the region, but also in countries like Iraq. But they have been always interested in the economic aspect of the relationship, but also they have been looking at some military contracts as well.
We have a question on the position of minorities in Iraq today. How do the minorities figure in the relationship with Prime Minister Kadhimi? Are the interests of Christians, Yazidis, and others advanced or not advanced by what the new government is doing?
Well, the Christian lady minister did not pass in parliament because the Christian MPs, most of them are against her. Having said that, it's early days to judge. I mean, I'm sure he has the intention of working with the minorities. We haven't seen it yet. I mean, the government is only 4 or 5 days old. It's too early to tell. I mean, when it comes to promise, yeah, he will promise the world, but we have to wait and see where he's heading to.
Well, could I ask each of you, because we're approaching the end time, if I could ask each of you to wrap up with, say, 2 or 3 minutes, beginning with Dr. Slim.
Well, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, on one hand, there are opportunities that Mr. Al-Kadhimi can build on. The fact that he has wide political support, except, with a couple of politicians, but he has had wide political support his, confirmation as prime minister. And the fact that the protesters so far seems to, say no to him, but there are theories about how they are being politically motivated in taking this stance. But he has some of the moves he has undertaken, like reinstating General Saadi to the CTS service, a demand of the protesters, the move against the Allah, something that pleased part of the street in terms of action against militias and groups like that, the release of detainees from the protesters. So he has taken some early actions which has created some goodwill toward him. I think, as I said in my remarks, the twin challenge of COVID-19 and the declining oil prices are going to really place severe limitations on how much he can move on issues like security sector reform, like fighting corruption, like structural reforms, which are important for the growth of the economy and for security in the future. And so I think we have to, while the international community has to, provide support, including the United States, I think they also have to temper their expectations about what can be achieved by a government that has, at best, maybe 2 years in tenure. And the whole issue of early election, we did not talk about that. I think the logistics of the process in terms of the election law, in terms of the mechanics, are going to make it a bit difficult for him to, live up to the promise of early elections. So we might have to, maybe wait until 2022 to see what is the new electoral map of the country, and that will determine the kind of political leaderships for the cabinets going forward.
Dr. Pfaff.
Oh, thanks. I think I'll start by just picking up on the Russia thing again, because I think it's worth mentioning that rather than buying M1 tanks, the Iraqis, I think it was about last year, purchased a number of T-90 Russian tanks, which not only confirms Russia's interest, but suggests it's mutual. Now, how do we take that? I think then it's worth remembering that, countries like Kuwait have a fair number of Russian rocket launchers as well as Chinese artillery. So the fact that Gulf countries and countries like Iraq want to have those kinds of security relationships, it just makes sense from their point of view, and something to pay attention to, but not something to get too alarmed about. But as far as the current topic regarding Khatami's nomination, I think from the United States point of view, I think we cannot ask for a better set given the given the field of interlocutors such as Khatami as well as Saleh, because both represent a new and more progressive, I think, leadership taken together. Because Al-Khatami's earned respect in Washington during his time as head of Iraqi intelligence, and before that, that's just it. And he's got kind of a unique background from other Iraqi prime ministers in the past. He's been a civil society leader, a journalist, a human rights activist. I think he understands how to make the most of his mandate. And is quite well aware of the difficult circumstances in Iraq. So it's kind of up to Washington right now. So in some sense, it's kind of up to Washington right now. Often the hardest thing to do is nothing, and that may be the right choice. But I do think this is, I think we're, like I said before, I think we're at a moment where his nomination represents where to not just demonstrate, not just assist him in achieving, goals that are beneficial for Iraq, but demonstrating that the United.
Hello, lost you there.
Hello? Oh, me.
Yes. I lost Dr. Pfaff.
Yes.
Maysoon, please.
Well, I think Al-Khatami will need international support, both economically and politically. He shouldn't be cornered into having only a relationship with Iran. I think previously this kind of support was really lacking, especially with Adel Abdel-Mahdi. The U.S. has lost many lives in the fight against ISIS, and before that even with Saddam Hussein. I think there is a moral attachment to Iraq. The war, the fight has to finish. We have now a war on corruption that has to end. Iraq has to be built as a modern nation, and we need the support of the international community and especially of the U.S.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. It has been a very, for me, particularly informative discussion. Iraq is a country whose importance in the region cannot be underestimated. I have a lot of friends in the lower Gulf who lamented so much that Iraq ceased to be a balancing power in the region. But anyway, I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. I would like to thank everyone for the participation. Thank you again. I wish we could clap online.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.